Our next speaker is Luke Thompson. So Luke started off pastor, and he was in Ottawa, Canada, which is cold and north of us. Do you guys, anybody know the importance of Ottawa, Canada? It's the capital of Canada. By a show of hands, who didn't know that? Well done. Didn't know that. Yes, I understand. Actually, when I was double checking with Luke how to intro him, and he said he was from Ottawa, Canada, I'm like, oh yeah. And he was, that's the capital. I'm like, yes, I knew that. I knew that. So Luke was up there 8 years hanging out, being pastor, loving on the people there. And then he got a call to Martin Luther College to be a professor there. Now, I knew more of you. Our paths hadn't crossed that much at that point. Since then, we've done a few things together, being at different events. But I more knew of his work and was super impressed with papers he wrote and the intellectual that he's got. Is that a thing? Okay. And when he doesn't even know this, but I was praying for you that you would accept it. And I knew how hard that would be because I was a pastor at a church, and I didn't want to leave my people that I loved. And the little bit I knew of you in your heart, I knew it would be really hard for you to leave your people there. And I was praying for you man, it'd be so good if he would go to MLC and be an influencer there. And the Lord moved his heart, and he's been serving at Martin Luther College, and now he gets to serve you here. Please welcome Luke Thompson.
Thank you very much, John. Someone asked me yesterday what we were going to do, and I didn't really know how to answer it. I've got really no idea what we're about to do here. I really have no kind of elevator pitch for the type of stuff we're going to do, except to say that maybe we'll talk a lot of philosophy, but it will be incredibly practical. We're going to end with an awful lot of spiritual care kind of stuff. And so with that, all right, so Alistair McIntyre, he is a philosopher that wrote a book called After Virtue. He's Catholic, I think, but he's a very famous philosopher, especially for this book. And in that book, he wrote this. He said, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story do I find myself a part? Okay? I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story do I find myself a part. And I think this is one of the most revelatory things we can think about when it comes to what does it mean to be a human, how do we understand ourselves, and how do we decide what to do the very next moment to moment in our lives. And maybe one way of kind of thinking about this I can get the clicker to work. There we go. All right, so this is a book called Les Miserables. And raise your hand if you've seen the musical. I think the musical is the greatest musical that's ever been produced. I think the book is 100 times better than the musical. It is fantastic. And I'm part of a book club in which we only read the greatest books of all time. We're only going to spend our time reading the best of the best, and right now we're reading Les Mis. And literary people call the book The Brick because it's so incredibly big. It's around 1,400 pages or so. And we're spending a lot of time right now having fun reading this. And I would like to just maybe put to you a question. If we were to just pick a random paragraph in the middle of this book and look at that paragraph, would you have any idea what's going on in the story? Can you make any judgment about the characters, about what's going to happen next, about whether or not what you're seeing is a good thing or a bad thing? And here's one example. Okay, just one example. So this is from, it's just random, right? It's just a random part. What happened before this is a woman is trying to find a home to take care of her child and sees a mother with 2 children outside of an inn. Okay, that's just the immediate context. Paradise is heralded by the presence of angels. She thought she could see above this inn the mysterious here of providence. She gazed at them. She marveled at them, at the children playing, with such feeling that she could not help saying, "You have 2 lovely children there, madame. It was the good Lord that guided me to your inn. When I saw your little ones looking so pretty and so clean and so happy, my heart turned over. I said to myself, here is a good mother. For sure, my child and hers will be like three sisters. All right, so raise your hand if you think the mother with the two children is going to be a good character in the book. Raise your hand if you think she's going to be bad. Now, how are you going to tell whether or not she's good or bad? You need to read the book. In fact, there's literally no way at all to tell whether or not she is a good character or a bad. The author is giving us hints that at least the one woman thinks that she is a good character, but in effect, the author is introducing us here to one of the most villainous characters in all of literature, the Thénardier mother, right? And those of you that raised your hands, you only did that because you saw the play, right? Right? That's the only reason, right? Otherwise, you'd have no idea whatsoever. One more example. So here, a child, his name's Petit Gervais, he drops a coin, and a man puts his foot over that coin, okay? The child, meanwhile, had been watching where his coin went and saw this. "Monsieur, give me back my coin." The man lowered his head and said nothing. The child repeated, "My coin, monsieur." The child wept, "Please give me back my coin." And suddenly rising to his full height with his foot still covering the silver coin, the man said, "Get lost, will you?" Now again, this man that we're being introduced to, is he a good character or is he a bad character? Now, we got a couple thumbs down. Raise your hand if you think this is a bad character. Okay, raise your hand if you think this is a good character. It doesn't really matter whether or not you raised your hand or not, because you've got no idea, right? There's no way you can test this out unless you read the rest of the book. And in fact, we are here being introduced to, despite how villainous the character seems, one of the greatest heroes in all of literary history, Jean Valjean, right? And in fact, at this very moment, a little bit later, we find out that the Holy Spirit is at war within his heart right now, that there's a great waging war taking place, and that there is a conversion taking place in this man's heart, a transformation through this event that to all eyes just seems completely evil and nonsensical. The point being is that there's no possible way that you have any idea what's going on with any single paragraph unless you know the entire story. Does that make sense? So, when our philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre, when he says, "I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story do I find myself a part?" This is incredibly revelatory, because this means that when it comes to you and what you are supposed to do next with your life, the only way you can figure this out is if you know what the larger story is. This is absolutely true. There is no way around this. You have to be able to picture your life as one small little paragraph in one giant book, and that there is no possible way for you to know how to judge your life, whether the next event that's about to happen is good or bad, whether or not you are a villain or a hero, whether or not the people that you are spending time with are villains or heroes. There's no possible way unless you know what the larger story is. And that larger story, well, what kind of story is it? Is it a comedy like Bill and Ted? How many of you relate yourselves to Bill and Ted, right? Is it a tragedy, right? Like Macbeth, right? We've got Denzel Washington's Macbeth in the middle. Or do you see your life as an epic fantasy, right? Like Chronicles of Narnia. This matters, right? This is going to determine entirely what you are going to do with the very next day of your life, what the story is. Well, now what kind of stories are we told? The idea of having this overarching story that you find your own story within, philosophers call this a meta-narrative. Okay, the idea is that there is a meta-narrative, a mega-narrative, sometimes an above-narrative that each one of us find our smaller narratives within. And different philosophers, scientists, people, they will give us different types of meta-narratives. And in general, these meta-narratives will answer questions like, will there be a happy ending? This is pretty important, right, for being able to determine what kind of a story you're in and what you should do with your life. Will there be a happy ending? What about suffering? Is it meaningful or is it meaningless? Right, the events that we have in our lives, the hardships, do they just kind of happen? Or is there some kind of purpose behind it? Or is there some way that this is woven into a greater story, right? And then finally, only by answering those first few questions are you able to then to determine what your part in the story is. So, different scientists, philosophers will give us different meta-narratives. Does anyone know what we're looking at here? This is an incredibly famous photo. It's one of the most famous photos of the second half of the 20th century. Any idea? What do we got here? What's that? That is Earth, right? So this is the pale blue dot photograph that was taken by Voyager 2, I think. And so it was 1990 when this photograph was taken, and this was the first photograph of Earth that we ever got. We're really far away from Earth looking back at it. It's the first time that we've had a photograph where we've got Earth in its context of deep space. And when this photograph was first taken and shared with everyone, everyone's kind of celebrating it, because what was kind of interesting about it was that while the photograph was taken, you can see that there's like a bar of light that kind of runs through. It's kind of a bit of a lens flare there, and right in that bar of light, that little white dot, that is Earth. And it looks like in this enveloping darkness, there's this band of light, and there's Earth kind of in this privileged position there. The problem is that the only reason that band of light is there is because there's like a lens flare or something with the camera that's taking place. And there was a famous scientist that pointed this out. So Carl Sagan, he was kind of the Neil deGrasse Tyson of his time. He was a popularizer of science, and he wrote a book called The Pale Blue Dot, all about this photograph. And in this book, he said, this is what we really ought to think about when we see this photograph. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity and all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. So Carl Sagan, who's an atheist, he's an evolutionary thinker, believes that the universe has been created by a mindless Big Bang. When he looks at this photo, what is this evidence of for him? The Earth is just a meaningless speck in an otherwise infinitely large, meaningless universe. And if that's the case, then, well, what does that mean about everything that happens on that meaningless speck? Everything there is really meaningless as well. We might think that we're privileged, that there's something special about us, but scientist Carl Sagan tells us there's nothing special about us at all, right? And so this is part of a secular meta-narrative that gets told about, well, who are we? What kind of larger story are we a part of? And the kind of evolutionary scientific story of this is there was a purposeless Big Bang, and we just kind of find ourselves meaninglessness here, right? And so different other people will kind of riff off of this a little bit. For example, Michel Foucault, his philosophy that he was developing in the 70s and 80s has become incredibly influential for us today. And so he did not believe that there was a God and that we were also kind of created by these mindless forces, so to speak. But then how should we look at each other? How should we kind of analyze the world? He believed that the most important way of doing this was to just analyze the different kind of power relationships. And he saw power relationships as what produced what we think of as knowledge and truth. And so he wrote, the individual with his identity and characteristics is the product of a relation of power. So in other words, your entire identity is completely created alone from whatever power conflicts exist, right? You aren't really you. You are just the product of whatever kind of forces in the universe are kind of like fighting it out. Particularly, he'll talk about things like oppressor and oppressed forces and things like that. Now, that kind of language, does that sound familiar at all? Right? That our entire world is a construct based on power struggles. That's going to turn eventually into what's kind of foundational for a lot of critical theorists, including critical race theorists. For example, Richard Delgado, in a very famous introduction to critical race theory, he says, for the critical race theorist, objective truth, like merit, does not exist. Truth is a social construct created to suit the purposes of the dominant group. So whatever you think is truth, the only reason you think it's truth is because the dominant groups in society have decided that that's true and that it serves the dominant group. Okay, that's kind of the baseline for at least some people that identify themselves as critical race theorists, right? That's ultimately where truth comes from. And if that's the case, then what does that do for who you are in the story that you find yourself in? Well, everything that you thought was knowledge, everything that you thought was true, is really just the product of someone else and the powers and things like that. This could all maybe get summed up into a real quick phrase here, and we'll get hopefully a little brighter conversation in a minute here. There's very few philosophers that look like their philosophy. I think this one kind of hits the nail on the head. This is a guy named Arthur Schopenhauer, and he's famous for being a kind of a curmudgeon, negative guy. And he says, no one has the remotest idea why the whole tragicomedy exists, for it has no spectators, and the actors themselves undergo endless worry with little and merely negative enjoyment. Right? So if we're to take everything that we've looked at so far and ask ourselves, well, what kind of story do we find ourselves in? He says it is a tragicomedy. It's a comedy because we think we're important, but we're really not. We're just specks on an island in the middle of a vast, infinite nothingness. And the reason it's tragic is because really there's no purpose to any of this all. Right? So that's the narrative that he would find us in. And this is reflected then in your art, whether or not you know this. Okay? So for example, just think of how this would answer the questions. Will there be a happy ending? Obviously, no, right? There's no happy ending. If you're talking about your life, whatever you're going to be doing with your life, it's not going to really result in anything of any purpose. And the universe, it's just your earth is going to die whenever the sun dies or whatever. What about suffering? Is suffering meaningful or meaningless? It's meaningless. It just kind of happens, right? It's just part of life, and there's no reason that it happened. There's no necessarily anything good that's going to come back. That's just the way things are. And then finally, well, what's my role in the story? There really isn't any role, so to speak. You just get to construct what you want out of your life, but there's no overarching reason that you're here, no reason that you're part of any story to be told. Does that make sense? And again, this is reflected in art. So here's George R.R. Martin. He's the creator of Game of Thrones. And he was interviewed once, and the interviewer was talking to him about how his series, Game of Thrones, a lot of bad things happen in Game of Thrones. For every maybe one good thing that happens, there's 3 really horrible things that happen. He will purposely introduce you to a character, make you love the character, and then kill it off very quickly. He will purposely make you fall in love with a character just to see that character kind of spiral into an evil nothingness at the end of it. He does this purposely, and the interviewer was asking him, well, why are you doing this? There's few acts of kindness in your novels. If somebody is on their own or weakened, they can pretty much expect everybody to take advantage of them or treat them terribly. Obviously, and this is kind of interesting, obviously Aslan is not going to save the day. But are your books cynical about human nature? Is Game of Thrones cynical about human nature? And his answer is interesting. He says, I think the books are realistic. Okay? So his fantasy books, he believes at the core, they are describing the very real condition that humans find themselves in. I've always liked gray characters, and as for the gods, I've never been satisfied by any of the answers they are given. If there really is a benevolent, loving God, why is the world full of rape and torture? Why do we even have pain? Right? So we see that Martin, anyways, he believes his artwork is meant to reflect his meta-narrative of what he thinks the world is really like. And so we find some examples of that. For example, in the first book, A Game of Thrones, Here we've got a character named Sansa. Here's a quick quote. Frog-faced Lord Slint sat at the end of the council table wearing a black velvet doublet and shiny cloth of gold cape, nodding with approval every time the king pronounced a sentence. Sansa stared hard at his ugly face, remembering how he had been thrown down, or how he had thrown down her father for Sir Ilan to behead, wishing she could hurt him, wishing that some hero would throw him down and cut off his head. But a voice inside her whispered, "There are no heroes." And she remembered what Lord Peter had said to her here in this very hall. Life is not a song, sweetling. He'd told her, you may learn that one day to your sorrow. In life, the monsters win, she told herself. And now it was the hound's voice she heard, a cold rasp, metal on stone, save yourself some pain, girl, and give him what he wants. And Martin says he believes his books are realistic. Okay? So all of this philosophy we're talking about, it has major implications for what you think the universe is like, and then how you believe you ought to live within this universe and judge things within this life. Does that make sense? Now let's compare this to a slightly different book. So these are actually lines from the movie, one of the Lord of the Rings movie. Raise your hand if you've seen the movie or the book. Raise your hand if you haven't. Do we have any Philistines among us? Okay. So the general plot goes something like this. There are two little people called hobbits. And these hobbits are not heroes, they're not strong, they're really nothing special, and they are tasked with taking this great evil thing, a ring, and bring it into the deepest, darkest, most evil land and get it destroyed there. And the point of it is that this task looks completely hopeless, right? Completely hopeless that these two insignificant, weak little creatures can somehow do this great deed in this land full of evil monsters and darkness. And at one point, one of the hobbits, Frodo, says, I can't do this, right? This is an impossible task. I can't do this, Sam. And Sam responds, I know, it's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here, but we are. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered, full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't because they were holding on to something. Well, what are we holding on to, Sam? That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. So this is a radically different kind of world. There's just as much evil, just as much pain and suffering as in a Game of Thrones book, but in the midst of all of this, somehow there is a goodness that is worth fighting for. There is somehow some way that this story's evil is going to be worked out for good. And when Tolkien was asked about this, he ended up writing a big essay on this idea of fairy stories and why Tolkien, who was an Oxford professor, why he would spend all of his time writing these weird fairy stories. And so he gave a defense of it in an essay called On Fairy Stories. And so he talks about the nature of fairy stories and why good fairy stories are so important. He says, the consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, the good catastrophe. His word for this is the eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist. So this idea that fairy stories have a sudden good turn to the end of it, where they end well despite all of the hardships that you saw, somehow a good ending gets turned into this. He says this is what's supremely important about fairy stories, and most importantly, it's not escapist. Okay, it's not escapist. It's not escapism when you're reading something like Lord of the Rings. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat insofar as evangelium, good news, right? Giving a fleeting glimpse of joy. Now, if it's not escapism, if it's reflecting something real, well, what's the real story that good fairy stories reflect, or that like a book like Lord of the Rings reflect? He says, the birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merit. Do you see what he's saying there? Right? The gospel message is the real eucatastrophe, the real joyous ending that we can find in our very real meta-narrative for our lives. If we can find our own lives within this meta-narrative, right, this story that ends well, then that transforms everything about who we are and what we're doing here. Right? This gives you a meaning and purpose that you can't find anywhere else. So, for example, we've got our photograph here, right? The reason that Sagan likes this photograph is because it seems to show that the physical location of Earth is inconsequential. Out of an infinite dark, Earth is just one kind of random speck in the middle of it. Well, other than physical location, what other things might we consider if we're trying to determine whether the Earth is special? So for the sake of argument, we'll grant Carl Sagan, there's nothing significant or special about the location of Earth in the vast darkness. But is there anything else that we might talk about that might make Earth a special place? Well, God through Isaiah describes the earth like this. For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, God himself who formed the earth and made it, who established it and did not create it to be a worthless waste. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no one else. Okay, so how is Earth different than anywhere else in the universe as far as we are concerned? Maybe as far as its physical location goes, we've got trouble saying that there's something significant. But is there something significant about this planet? It is exploding with life, right? Everywhere else is a waste. This is the one place in the entire universe where there isn't just life, but it is exploding with beauty, exploding with diversity, millions, billions of different types of life forms. When scientists talk about looking for life on other planets, you know what they're looking for, right? They're looking for like water, right? They're looking for maybe possible chemicals that if combined for a second would be something that we would call life. They are looking for the most minimal thing that you could possibly say would be needed for life. And they have trouble finding even that. And here we are exploding with it, right? So much life we don't know what to do with it. And when we look then at our relationship with the life here, the psalmist says this, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. Well, why is this the place that is exploding with life? And not only that, but us being here, what's the rest of the universe out there for us? It's almost as if it was all designed for humans, right? That we can understand the value of the rest of the universe because of who we are and our position. One of our scholars in WELS writes this in one of his commentaries. For God, the work of creating huge galaxies was detailed fingerwork like fine needlepoint. We might think that the creation of mankind was even more trivial since the world we inhabit is nothing but a microscopic speck in God's universe. Yet God created Adam and Eve to have dominion over the world he made. Even the sun, moon, and stars were created to serve them. Created in God's image, Adam and Eve seemed only a little lower than the angels, right? Only a little lower than the angels. right? So what are humans like here? Man, and what is our relationship to the rest of the universe? But we can say so much more than just this, right? Now we're already saying there's maybe something unique about this place in the universe and our relationship to the place of the universe being right here. We can add one more major thing here. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. What happened on this speck of the universe that did not happen anywhere else? This is the only place that God decided to dwell in bodily form. Nowhere else. This is the only place in the universe that God showed himself full of grace and truth. And why is this the only place in the universe where God decided to do this? Because this was the only place in the universe where his children dwelt. His children that he needed to put humanity on for the sake of saving. I think that makes this a privileged planet, don't you? This is the place that God dwelt, that he died for our sins, and that his church now shares that message. We can't find that anywhere else. That is the meta-narrative that we find ourselves a part of, and there are implications from this. So, I'm running out of time. We'll have to skip this Tolkien quote there. So think of our meta-narrative now, the Christian meta-narrative that we find ourselves in and how we look at these questions. Will there be a happy ending? What about suffering? Meaningful? Is suffering meaningful or meaningless? What's my role in the story? Let's take a look at some of these things. Well, can you think of any Bible verses, anything about Scripture that might tell us whether or not there will be a happy ending? Can you think of anything that might be useful for this, that you might want to think about every now and then if you're not too sure whether or not things are going to end well? How about this? Romans 8:28, maybe the most useful Bible passage you will ever memorize, that you will ever hear. Okay, maybe the most useful passage ever for encouraging friends that are going through hard times. We know that in all things, there's no qualification to this. Okay, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Okay? What does that mean? That means it will end well. Okay, it will end well. The way I like to summarize this and teach it to my students, we got a little touchy slide here. This is the line to memorize. I've got 13 of these. We're going to look at 3. It will be all right. You are safe. This will end well. Okay? There is not a Christian that exists that you cannot say that to. There is not a single event that you are going through in your life that a Christian cannot say that to while you are going through it. There is nothing that your friend is going through that you cannot remind them of this. Okay? There are no qualifications to this. And this is only something that Christians get to say because of our meta-narrative. No one else has a meta-narrative that allows us to say without qualification to another Christian, it will be all right, you are safe, this will end well. Okay? What about suffering? Is it meaningful or meaningless? Here's one example. There's lots of scripture we can obviously look at for this one. So Paul, at some point he's suffering. He's got this thorn. We don't know what it is. Don't even bother asking. But he's complaining about what this thorn is that God has put in his life. And he repeatedly asks him over and over and over again, God, take this thorn away from me. And what does God say? He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. What does Christ do with the sufferings that you go through? somehow he is able to use that suffering, those experiences that you are going through, and that is his way of displaying his power. Okay? And so there's a weird equation that goes along with this. The more you suffer, the more God's power is displayed in your life and in the life of the people around you. Somehow God, in all of his providence and wisdom and knowledge, has been able to take the evil and the pain and the suffering of this world and to transform it into some type of good for his church. And it's all like this. It's all like this. We'll look at one more, and then we'll look at maybe at a couple scenarios. So God works his goodwill through suffering. That's our second truth. One more. So what's my role in the story? Well, does God give us any kind of clear directions about how we might see our lives a little bit differently than people that have different kind of meta-narratives? How about this one? You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. So if you were to, I got a couple students here that need to be quiet. If you were to summarize all of Christian ethics into just one word, what would that one word be? Not love. And the reason we're not going to use love is because when the world uses the word love, they mean something completely different, right? Completely different. If you were to summarize all of Christian ethics into one word, what would that one word be? According to Paul here, service, right? I would submit submission, okay? That the Christian is called to submit to the people in his or her life, okay? To serve. Why? Because Christ came to serve, not to be served, and that's now who we are, right? That's what we've been called into. So we have a very clear definition of what the purpose of a Christian life is in this world. It is, strictly speaking, that God has called me to serve, not to be served. And if we're thinking about that for what my purpose is in life, what your purpose is in life, all of a sudden that changes things a bit. How we assess situations, right? A few examples here. So we've got our three truths, and in breakout sessions a little bit later, I think there's going to be some stuff passed out where you can maybe work on some of this as well. But tell me here, which of the following truths above there, those first three, would be most useful to share in the following scenario? Okay, Denise, and all the scenarios we're looking at are real ones. The names are changed, but real ones from times of spiritual counseling that I've done. Denise was sexually assaulted in high school by a coach, and now in college she needs to testify in court in a trial against him. She feels alone, powerless, and helpless. In a secular worldview, where everything's meaningless, we're just an infinitely meaningless speck in an infinite nothingness, what would you have to say to her? Well, you probably are alone, powerless, and helpless. But what can you tell her? What can you tell this Christian sister? You're safe, right? It will be all right. Whatever happens at this trial, it will be all right. And as you are in that box testifying, you are safe, right? Your God is with you, right? Your shepherd is holding you, his sheep, in the palm of his hand. There is not a wolf in this world that can hurt you, right? You are safe. And this will end well. This will end well. That is the truth of the meta-narrative that we orient our lives and our experiences around. Does that make sense? Okay, one more, or two more. Sam is brilliant, but now has depression. He can't work to his full potential. He's constantly asking God, why did you give me my talents? And then a condition that won't let me use them. And this was, Sam, this was hard counseling him because he was a brilliant guy. And then he got this depression and he just couldn't use his gifts. And he just felt like he was just wasting his life away as he was just waiting, to be able to get a handle on his condition. What can you say to him? Which of these three truths you think might be useful You might phrase it a little differently, right? You might want to pick and choose kind of gently, but what truth do you ultimately want to communicate to him? Which of those three do you think would be useful? Obviously, the first one. It's going to turn out that that first one is useful in lots of situations. Besides the first one? Why number two? Yeah, right. Sometimes what we get in our minds is God has given me this awesome ability, and when I use this awesome ability, then this is me fulfilling God's plans. But if I can't use this awesome ability, right, if I can't use this very awesome, cool to use thing that God has given me, then I'm just kind of wasting my life away. And that's not the truth, because what is God doing while we are suffering? He is making his power known, right? He is making us perfect through his weakness. Right? So even Sam's depression, God is somehow working through that suffering for his good and for the good of the church just as much as if he was using whatever skills that he had. Does that make sense? Okay, one more. Since Tanya has become politically active, I put this one in here after Rich Gergel's talk last night. Since Tanya has become politically active, she's also become a lot more angry. She can't stop talking about her rights and about how the political group she's identifying with is treated so poorly by the other side. What might it be useful to talk about? Which one of the truths? First of all, the first one, right? Politically, Jesus says, do not worry. Right? He says, you're more valuable than the birds that he takes care of in the most ideal way possibly, because you have the value of Christ himself. You don't need to worry about anything, right? So that means when it comes to voting and whatever's going to happen to our country, we don't need to worry, right? Now, never tell someone don't worry, because the moment you tell them don't worry, they start to worry, right? It's a little bit more useful, I found, to just say you don't have to worry. Right? You do what God has designed you as a human to do, but you need to know, right, that you don't have to worry. Right? Our meta-narrative makes it very clear that there isn't any reason to worry. But besides that, obviously, the third one is huge, right? Sometimes, I think, especially in our American context, we have been groomed a little bit to think that somehow the most important thing in the world is me and my personal rights, and that no one touches me and my personal rights, and that I fight tooth and nail against anyone that is going to step into my rights at all. No one treads on me, right? Like I think this is a deep feeling that maybe a lot of us have grown to feel. How does that jive with God has called me to serve, not to be served? Right? Now, part of my serving other people is being interested in making sure that they get justice and things like that, right? Fighting for the oppressed, right? But that's different than me fighting for myself, right? That's different than this idea of recognizing that the primary purpose for me here is that I'm here to serve other people. And sometimes that's painful. Sometimes that means giving things up. But it will be all right. You are safe. It will end well. So with that, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story I find myself in. I think this is one of the most important things for us to think about right now, especially when we have so many conflicting stories being told us about who we are and our place in this universe. And so I'm looking forward to hearing about what kind of discussions you guys have in the small groups. There'll be a few more different scenarios like that in the truths, and maybe you can find a few new ways of being able to very concretely redirect people back onto God's Word, onto these meta-narrative truths. So thank you. Yep.